The latest MCU film, Fantastic Four First Steps, has dropped in theaters, thus rendering every PG-13 MCU film from the worst to the best. I say PG-13 to let you know I'm not including Deadpool and Wolverine because I have to make that distinction now. I'm also not including any Disney Plus shows or specials. That in mind, let's get started. In last place is Eternals. I will acknowledge the film itself looks gorgeous and it's got great cinematography, but the story and most of the characters are boring and the film is melodramatic. It tries to have all these ideas about divine intervention and letting bad things happen, but it all comes off as very pretentious. The film, for some reason, is also told out of order, where we jump ahead to characters' deaths, but then one scene later we see them again. I acknowledge the ambition, but the execution is incredibly dull. 35 Multiverse of Madness, an occultishly dark, graphically violent, and overly long film. When I go to an MCU movie, I'm expecting a fair bit of lightheartedness, but the majority of this film is just darkly occult, and this is coming from somebody who enjoys Harry Potter, but I just left the movie with a very dark feeling. It felt violent for shock value and for the sake of being violent, as opposed to being done tastefully. And on top of that, they ruined Scarlet Witch by making her irredeemably evil. The minute you try to murder a child, that's the worst thing you can do, and shame on you, Marvel, for taking her character in that direction. Number 34, Incredible Hulk. It's slow and boring, and on its own feels very out of place. The plot isn't that compelling, the film is dull. Apart from a few scenes that feel like a monster movie, this film is a slog. Number 33, Thor: The Dark World. The movie's biggest problems are the first 20 minutes are a lot of exposition given to the audience at once, and the villain is boring. The only reason to even watch this movie is for the scenes with Loki and the death of a character that ties into Avengers Endgame, but this is one that you can still justify skipping. Number 32, Captain Marvel. Much like the Star Wars Solo movie or the Amazon Rings of Power show, this movie gives us answers to questions nobody was asking. However, the difference between this film and Solo and Rings of Power is that those are enjoyable. It's hard to care about Carol Danvers as a character because she's already overpowered from the first scene, and it doesn't really feel like she grows or changes throughout the film. The film also feels like they just wanted to make another Guardians of the Galaxy film, but without anything about Guardians of the Galaxy that made those films fun. We need a quirky alien animal sidekick, so here's Goose the Cat. We need retro music and references. We need space battles. Given where the MCU was at this point in time, it feels more like a Phase 1 movie as opposed to a Phase 3 movie. It feels like a step back. Number 31, Wakanda Forever. I appreciate the way this film pays tribute to the late Chadwick Boseman and deals with themes of grief. Out of the Phase 4 movies, this feels the most human and personal, but when the film isn't honoring Chadwick Boseman, it gives us too many plot lines. Besides the main plotline about Shuri dealing with the loss of her brother, there's also the plotline about Riri Williams, who, much like America Chavez from Multiverse of Madness, doesn't really feel like a character, but rather a plot device. Her last name might as well be MacGuffin, and by having her build an iron suit, it kind of negates Tony's sacrifice. What made Tony special was that he didn't have powers, but he was a tech genius, and he was such a tech genius that he's the only one able to build these suits. When anybody else tries to build them, they're just crude versions. Obadiah Stane in the first Iron Man film just takes the leftover scraps from the suit Tony built to escape captivity and doesn't really know how to use it. When Justin Hammer tries it in Iron Man 2, the test pilots all get seriously injured, and again, their suits are just cheaper knockoffs. Spider-Man's suits that he builds himself aren't fancy, they're just a hoodie and goggles. All of his fancier tech comes from Tony later. And sure, in Far From Home he builds himself a tech suit, but he does so with Tony's technology, and after having been mentored by Tony for a few years, so much so that Tony leaves Peter an AI so he can continue his legacy. So really, Tony's the only one who can build these things. But now the film expects us to buy into the idea that a teenage girl who, as far as we know, has never met Tony Stark in her life, can build her own iron suit. Making a machine to detect vibranium I can buy into, but being able to build a fully fledged iron suit is where it doesn't make sense. I get she's smarter than average, but if anybody can build these things now, you take away what made Tony Stark unique. To quote Syndrome, when everyone's super, nobody is. And the Ironheart show it sets up wasn't even good. It turned her into a villain at the end, so this just seems pointless. And then there's the thin plotline about Martin Freeman's character that I just don't care about. And because the film is so somber, dealing with some very serious themes, when there is humor, it feels unnatural, awkward, and inappropriately timed. The film has a lot of emotion, but is overstuffed. Number 30, Iron Man 2. An example of a film that had potential, but was ultimately bogged down by its own ambition and too many plot lines. This feels like less of a story focusing on Tony, and more of a setup for the first Avengers film. It seems like for every good idea they had, they also counteracted it with a bad idea. Whiplash is a great villain, But then you have Justin Hammer, who is over the top and goofy, and has incredibly stupid motivations. You have an interesting storyline about Tony's arc reactor poisoning him, but then the film also has scenes like Tony at a party peeing in his suit and then fighting War Machine. And it's like Marvel was so insecure about whether a sequel to Iron Man, which is already a huge gamble, would work, they basically said yes to every idea that was pitched. Number 29, Thor. A film that I'm kind of mixed on. Kenneth Branagh brings his own unique style to this film, and there are some fun moments of Thor getting some culture shock with Earth customs, but there's nothing particularly ambitious about this film. It just feels like a typical comic book movie without anything about it that stands out apart from the cinematography. Number 28, Iron Man 3. It's a problem when the best part about the movie is not the main character. The best parts about it are the scenes with Harvey and the scenes with Trevor Slattery. Now, I know a lot of people aren't a fan of the Mandarin twist, but given the events of Shang-Chi, I think it makes sense. And even before Shang-Chi came out, I've always somewhat defended the twist. Captain America the Winter Soldier sets up the idea about evil people being implanted as the true villains, while they use other people as pawns to be the Fall Guys. Personally, I think if they had released Winter Soldier first, it probably would have been better received. Number 27, Black Panther. The film has a lot of great action and at times comes off like a spy film. Chadwick Boseman's charisma really makes the film work. But on a story level, it has a lot of problems. The way a Wakandan society works doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. They don't choose their leaders based on their beliefs. They choose them based on who's the most brutal in combat. They're also so distrustful of each other that at the beginning of the film, when there's spies from Wakanda, they send other spies to spy on their own spies. And at the end of the film, the people of Wakanda decide they're going to open the border to show the rest of the world a better way of living, even though they just had a war among their own people. And there's also that one other tribe that they abandoned, just live in the mountains and cut off contact with until it was convenient. Even though the action scenes are really fun and the film can have a lot of style at times, on a story level it doesn't work that much for me. Number 26, Doctor Strange. An MCU entry that for me is enjoyable enough. The film does come off as a bit pretentious with its ideas about life, death, and other philosophical discussions that make it seem like it's trying to be The Matrix, that combined with the visuals that, while they are cool, are very reminiscent of Inception. The film does give the main character a great arc, which is why the other appearances of Doctor Strange, especially in Multiverse of Madness, where they essentially make him a bad guy at the end of the film, are so frustrating. On its own, it works, as long as you ignore who he is in the other films. Number 25, Thor Love and Thunder. I get the criticisms with this film. If it was too goofy for you, okay. But for me, it worked enough. The film succeeded in one aspect where the first two Thor films didn't. I actually cared about the relationship between Thor and Jane. I do think Christian Bale was a cool villain, but they did kind of waste him. I enjoyed it when I saw it, but it's not one that I clamor to watch very often. Number 24, The Marvels. The first Captain Marvel movie, like I said, I found pretty lackluster, trying to be another Guardians of the Galaxy film. This one, in terms of the tone, feels like its own thing. It feels less derivative of Guardians of the Galaxy, and more like something else. Even some of the shots in this movie are stylized like a comic book. And that's what I got, a fun comic book movie. It has scenes in it that I found wildly creative. There's a part where they go to an alien planet, and the aliens they meet are pretty fun. The filmmakers took what worked about the first one and expanded on it. Everyone loved Goose the cat, so now we get tons of his offspring. And what they do with these adorable but deadly kittens was one of the funniest scenes in the whole movie. In the first movie, I found Carol to be a pretty bland character, but here it actually feels like she has character flaws and overall is better written. But the performance that absolutely steals the show is Iman Vellani as Ms. Marvel. Do you love the infectious energy of Tom Holland's Spider-Man when he meets his heroes? Imagine a whole movie of that. The actor seems genuinely excited to be in the movie, and she is a delight. But there are still certain issues. For one, the movie does require homework. If you haven't watched WandaVision or Ms. Marvel, you're going to be lost. The other issue is the villain is pretty forgettable. Ronan from Guardians of the Galaxy? Yeah, nobody remembers that villain. This villain is basically the girl version of Ronan, and she's just as forgettable. But the majority of the movie, I had a massive grin on my face. It wasn't afraid to have fun, and had some good humor and some well-stylized action scenes. Number 23, Thor Ragnarok. After one Thor film that was kind of middle of the road, and a follow-up that was awful, Taika Waititi finally brings us a Thor film that gets it right. The first two films had almost no sense of fun. This film is a lot of fun. But it does try to basically be Guardians of the Galaxy, and I do think the Grandmaster as a villain doesn't work. I think we should have spent more time with Hela, because she was a much stronger villain. Number 22, Age of Ultron. Much like how Iron Man 2 was the filler chapter to prep for the first Avengers movie, this is the filler chapter to prep for Civil War. The cast, much like the first film, do still work well off each other, like the running joke about Cap telling people to watch their language, and even at the time newcomers Elizabeth Olsen and Aaron Taylor-Johnson give performances that feel like they've been there since the beginning of the MCU. They don't feel awkward because they're the new kids of the franchise. James Spader gives one of the best villain performances in the MCU as Ultron. Say what you will about how they wrote Ultron as a character, but his voice performance is chilling. The film does meander a bit in the second act, mostly to set up Civil War, and the romance between Bruce and Natasha comes out of nowhere, and goes nowhere after this film. It's not as high stakes or ambitious as the first Avengers film, but I still find it kind of entertaining. Number 21, Quantumania. Now, I enjoyed this movie. I thought the quantum realm was very creative. I thought Kathryn Newton worked well with Paul Rudd. But in terms of the tone, it's definitely the most serious of the three Ant-Man films. There is still some humor, but not nearly as much as the predecessors, so it's a bit of an odd tone shift. Michael Pena and the other comic relief from the previous two films aren't in this one, even as cameos, which is a little disappointing, and I do think they wasted Bill Murray in this film. They don't really give him a lot to do. However, the film still has grand spectacle, whereas the other two films were relatively small scale. It was still entertaining, but it definitely has a very different tone than the other two films. Number 20, Guardians of the Galaxy 2. The biggest problem with this movie for me is that it has jokes at places where there don't need to be jokes. Like Wakanda Forever, there are scenes in this that are meant to help the audience connect with the characters, but instead of pausing to let those moments sit, they immediately follow it up with a joke. And what's also frustrating is the events that get the Guardians to meet Ego are very contrived. They happen to land there because they get shot down because Rocket stole batteries. Okay. I do enjoy the character arc Star-Lord goes through, but some of the jokes needed to be cut, and the first act could have been less contrived. Number 19, Ant-Man. Considering this was originally supposed to be a Phase 1 movie, but they couldn't agree on a script or director, the film just kind of sat. That was kind of a bad sign. But I think this is one of those rare times where a film sitting in development for years actually worked to its advantage. There's a good chance that had it come out when it was supposed to during Phase 1, we may not have gotten Paul Rudd as the star, and I can't really imagine anyone else playing Scott Lang. Now, plot-wise, at least in terms of the villain, it is a little reminiscent of the first Iron Man film, but what gives it its own flavor is it's also a heist film. And the main character is someone who hasn't made the best decisions in life, and you want to see him turn his life around and succeed. The other two films of Phase 2 were political thrillers or big spectacle sci-fi films. This is a film that feels more human and goes back to the simplicity of Phase 1. It's not my favorite film in Phase 2, but it's pretty close. Number 18, Thunderbolts. This is one of the most human MCU films to date. While the franchise has long relied on quippy humor, sometimes to its detriment, Thunderbolts wisely dials it back. The humor that is present lands well and feels organic, never undercutting the emotional weight of the scenes. The cast absolutely sells it. Everyone has solid chemistry, and their performances add depth to characters that have often been sidelined or underserved in other MCU projects. The action is visceral and tightly choreographed, keeping things street-level and gritty for much of the runtime. That grounded quality is part of what makes the first two acts so compelling. Unfortunately, that focus and restraint don't carry through to the third act. The film takes a hard turn into overblown spectacle, introducing a villain who feels wildly out of place, like putting Thanos into the final episode of Daredevil. The tone of Whiplash is jarring. The first two-thirds of the movie are small-scale and personal, and suddenly it's world-ending stakes with a dark Superman figure who is neither fresh nor compelling. It's a trope that has been run into the ground by now, and here it feels lazy rather than meaningful. It's a shame because the rest of the movie is so strong. This mismatch between setup and payoff echoes a pattern we've seen in some of Marvel's Disney Plus shows. Solid build-up, followed by a finale that buckles under the weight of too much plot too fast. Honestly, I think the film might have worked better as a Disney Plus series, where its characters and conflict could breathe more and build naturally toward a climax that matches the grounded tone. Despite its third act misstep, Thunderbolts is still a standout in the modern MCU landscape. It's mature, emotional, and refreshingly light on jokes. If not for the disappointing villain, this could have ranked among the MCU's very best. Number 17, Iron Man. A film that, given its ingredients, was a huge gamble. Films like X-Men 3 The Last Stand, Fantastic Four, Superman Returns, and Spider-Man 3 were not very well received by critics or audiences, causing many to believe that apart from Christopher Nolan's Batman films, only the first of which had been released at the time, the comic book and film genre was essentially dead. Then out of nowhere, a newly formed studio called Marvel Studios announced they were making a film about Iron Man, a character that, outside of the niche comic book community, nobody had really heard of. Sure, Iron Man had a cartoon in the 90s, but it wasn't as successful as the other comic book cartoons running at the time, such as X-Men or Batman. It only lasted 26 episodes. On top of that, they announced the character would be played by Robert Downey Jr., who at the time was an actor nobody wanted to work with due to his substance abuse problems. On top of that, Jon Favreau was announced as the director. Favreau had directed films before, but his only two successful ones were Elf and Zathura, and even then, those were family films, not big blockbusters. By all accounts, this should not have worked, yet it somehow had all the right ingredients to pull it off. Downey Jr.'s charisma and comedic timing really helped the film, as well as its big exciting action sequences. While other comic book movies at the time were a bit sillier and more cartoonish, this one felt like it was taking itself seriously. and even though I don't like Iron Man as a character, I have to acknowledge it is a very well-made film. This is one of the only films from Phase 1 that still holds up, the other two for me being Captain America and the first Avengers movie. Number 16, Ant-Man and the Wasp, a film that's even funnier than the first. It takes everything that worked about the first one and expands it. The story is better than the first one because it feels like it has its own unique flavor, instead of being like Iron Man. Scott and Hope are a great duo in this one, and we also get more of the Wombats, who are one of the best parts of the first film, and where they take their story is pretty fun. Number 15, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This is one of the most fun films in the MCU. The action is extremely well choreographed and very fun to watch. The world building and mythology are incredibly interesting, and like I said, it fixes the controversial Mandarin twist from Iron Man 3, but I never really had a problem with that twist in the first place. What pushes it back a smidge is Awkwafina. She's very annoying and unfunny. The main character is so charming that to have her be the comic relief, and just have her be annoying brings it down. She's one of the most awkward parts of the film. Number 14, Captain America Brave New World. When this movie was first announced, I was very pessimistic. They announced this movie right after the finale of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which was a show that I was more negative on, and they announced that the director is the same as Cloverfield Paradox, which, as a standalone movie not connected to Cloverfield, is watchable, but as a Cloverfield movie, is not good. There are all these reports about reshoots and delaying the film after negative test screenings, and I think this is an example of where delaying the film helped it. Rogue One had reshoots, and even people who don't like Disney Star Wars really like that movie. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I liked this movie. One of my main problems with the Falcon series was they wrote him to be very cocky and arrogant, but here he isn't like that. He's actually likable, and his issue in this movie is how he's going to lead a new Avengers team in dealing with the weighted burden of that, and it's done really well. The action sequences in this movie really stand out. If you're a fan of some of the more street-level grounded MCU projects like Daredevil or Hawkeye, it's very much in line with that. Much like the Russo brothers' Captain America films, this feels like a political action thriller first, and a comic book movie second. And that's a good thing. In a time where a lot of the MCU is starting to feel very assembly line and micromanaged, this is a movie that still has its own identity. Even if you're not a comic book fan, you can enjoy the film if you're a fan of Mission Impossible, Jack Ryan, those kinds of movies. It takes things like MK Ultra and puts it in a comic book world. It doesn't even really start to feel like a comic book movie until the last 15 or 20 minutes. The plot is pretty intriguing. Harrison Ford is a stand-up performance, and I do kind of joke that this is essentially a sequel to Air Force One. Giancarlo Esposito is a great villain in this too. The film has a bit of a darker tone than some of the other MCU projects. I'd say this is the darkest Captain America movie yet, but it's not the level of dark that was Multiverse of Madness, The Agatha Show, or Werewolf by Night. It still has enough lightheartedness that stops it from feeling nihilistic. Now, the original title for the movie was New World Order, but they changed it to Brave New World because apparently the New World Order title made people uncomfortable, and I just ask, why? New World Order would have been a better title, because it's referring to the plan of the villains. Now, what does hold it back is it does unfortunately require a lot of homework. You need to have seen the 2008 Hulk movie, all the other Captain America movies, Infinity War, Endgame, and Eternals. Other than it feeling too weighted by previous projects, it's still a fantastic film. Number 13, Guardians of the Galaxy 3. The stakes for this movie are incredibly high, the characters all get satisfying arcs, and they all work extremely well with each other. And unlike a lot of MCU sequels that forgot what the previous film set up and don't follow through with, such as Baron Mordo in the first Doctor Strange film, everything set up in the previous film comes back and feels important. The stakes of the plot revolve around Rocket, and unlike Black Panther Wakanda Forever, where Riri Williams felt more like a plot device rather than an actual character, Rocket is an actual character in this film and not a MacGuffin. The way each character's arc ends is incredibly satisfying. Out of the three Guardians films, this is definitely the one with the most heart. I'd say it's almost perfect, but unfortunately what does hold it back is a pattern I'm noticing with MCU films is sometimes they are afraid to show too much negative emotion. There are some very dark moments of the film, and sometimes instead of letting the audience feel the weight, they try to lighten things up with jokes that can be a bit ill-timed. I know you want to lighten the tension, but sometimes it's more effective to let the audience feel something else. Another element that holds it back a bit is something that bogs down a lot of MCU projects. They expect you to have watched everything with these characters. If you go into the movie not having watched the holiday special on Disney+, you're going to be a bit confused by the beginning. There are certain characters and plotlines from that special that come back and are important, but if you haven't watched it or watched it recently, you're going to be confused. However, apart from needing to watch the holiday special, this is a film that feels very focused on its own narrative. It isn't trying to set up the next 10 movies and shows, it feels like it stands as its own story. What they do with certain characters imply they could bring them back if they want to, but it doesn't feel like a priority. This feels like a movie made by a filmmaker and not by a studio. It feels like a movie that was made the way the director wanted to make it, and not trying to work around 10,000 studio notes. It's an incredibly satisfying emotional end to the Guardians trilogy. Number 12, Guardians of the Galaxy. A film that was very oddly marketed. The trailer didn't show off any of the humor, so while the idea of having a movie where two of the characters are a raccoon and a tree seemed bananas, but much like Iron Man, it had just the right cast and the right story with well-written characters. The film serves as a redemption story with a very likable group of cast members who all work very well off each other. It's bizarre, it's out there, but it really works. Number 11, Black Widow. This, in my opinion, is how Brad Bird should have directed Incredibles 2. Incredibles 2 was disappointing to me, because instead of expanding on the ideas from the first film and having a movie about a crime-fighting family, it instead became essentially an Elastigirl movie, with a long Jack short thrown in as filler to an already thin movie. This is what I was hoping Incredibles 2 was going to be. Even though Brad Bird was not involved in this film, it feels like a lot of influence was taken from him, because this film is like a combination of the first Incredibles movie and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which Bird directed. The actors all have a very strong dynamic. The villain is one of the most despicable, non-superpowered MCU villains, right up there for me with Robert Redford's character from Winter Soldier. The action is well choreographed, the plot is intriguing, and even when the film slows down, the dialogue is also compelling and keeps you invested. I think it was worth the 11-year wait. Number 10, Spider-Man Far From Home. I liked this film a lot more when I first saw it, but upon rewatching it, it's slightly deteriorated in quality. That's not to say I don't like it. I mean, it's in the top 10 on a list of 30 movies. It's just that I see a lot of more issues that when I first saw it. The film's biggest problem is that this movie is essentially Spider-Man cleaning up Tony's messes even posthumously, so he's not really given a chance to be his own character until almost the end of the film. I think Jake Gyllenhaal was well cast as Mysterio, but his motivations, just like half the villains in the MCU, are a hatred for Tony Stark. Peter doesn't even get his own villain to fight. He gets Iron Man's leftovers. A lot of the humor in the film also feels needlessly crass, considering Spider-Man is still a teenager in this film, so a lot of the raunchier jokes come off as really ewy. And I also don't think Zendaya has any chemistry with Peter, so to have a big part of the film revolve around Peter trying to confess his love for her just doesn't work for me, since I don't care about them as a couple. It's still a fun movie, but is held back by its need to not let Tony Stark go. Number 9, Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man's first standalone entry to the MCU is a fun one. The film feels like a teen comedy from the 80s such as Ferris Bueller, but with superhero elements thrown in. Tom Holland plays the unconfident, fresh superhero-scene Spider-Man really well, but the film is also held back by, yes, its constant need to throw Iron Man in instead of just letting it be a solo Spider-Man film. Though apart from the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, this does feel for the most part like the most original source material. Number 8, Fantastic Four First Steps. It took 20 years, but we finally have a worthy Fantastic Four movie. Not only does it finally get the tones and characters right, but professionally it's an MCU project that does not require homework. And on top of that, it's a reboot that doesn't retell the origin story. It explains the origin, but doesn't spend half the movie on it. It's more akin to the intros of the CW Arrowverse shows. My name is Oliver Queen. After 5 years on a deserted island, I returned home with only one goal: save my city. My name is Barry Allen. I'm the fastest man alive. You get the idea. And this film is set on an alternate Earth, not the main MCU Earth. So it's not tied down to the other MCU projects and is given more free reign. Director Matt Shakman directed the WandaVision series, and this movie very much feels like the early episodes of that show that were pastiches of the 50s and 60s. The first two Fantastic Four movies were live-action cartoons in a bad way, but this is a live-action cartoon in the best way, mixed with old 1950s and 60s sci-fi serials. It's one part The Jetsons, one part Lost in Space, and one part Flash Gordon. It knows it's campy and embraces it, while at the same time being careful to not go too far with it. And it's refreshing to see a superhero film where the heroes are revered, not feared. There's been a lot of nihilistic comic book properties where the heroes are feared, and the government seeks to control and regulate them. But much like the Adam West Batman show, the authorities are cool with the heroes. Michael Giacchino does the score here, and his score is very reminiscent of his work on The Incredibles, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films, and Tomorrowland. Unlike the previous iterations of the Fantastic Four, where the chemistry between the actors fell flat, these actors actually feel like a real family and work well off each other with gentle, loving ribbing, and being willing to do anything for each other. This is one of the most human, emotional MCU films as of late. My only real criticism is the pacing can drag in certain parts. Compared to the majority of the MCU, there's not as much action. There are certain scenes that I feel are over-explained and go on for a bit too long, so maybe the pacing could have been tightened a bit. But that's a nitpick. The film is still nothing short of fantastic. Number 7, Captain America: The First Avenger. Up to this point in the MCU, we've had main characters who are geniuses, scientists, or gods. The main character in this one is neither of those things. He's just an ordinary guy who's trying his best to do the right thing, despite the challenges he was born into. And even after getting his powers, he doesn't let it go to his head, as is so often the case in these stories. He remains true to who he was before the serum. He doesn't fight for fame or glory or wealth. He fights because he wants to defend the country and people he loves. Setting the film in World War II makes it stand out from the rest of the films in the MCU, as none of the other films really have that same style. It's got great action, great script, and my favorite main character of the MCU. Number 6, Captain America Civil War. This has one of my most favorite fight scenes in the MCU with the airport battle. It's the cinematic equivalent of taking all your action figures and smashing them into each other. The film is well paced, and despite Cap's name being in the title, doesn't show just his side of the conflict. It presents Iron Man's point of view as well, and lets the audience choose who they want to side with. Personally, I'm Team Cap. The film was also the introduction of Black Panther and Spider-Man. Black Panther is really mysterious and cool, and of course, including Spider-Man after several years of rights negotiations with Sony blew our minds. There are 2 things about this film that I don't care for. The first being the issue of Cap trying to make Cap and Sharon a couple. The way they end Cap's story in Endgame, where he goes back to live with Peggy, now means that in that scene, he's kissing his niece. And even before we know that, he only met her 1 movie ago and knew so little about her that they didn't even know Sharon was related to Peggy until Peggy's funeral. So either way, it's incredibly weird. The Russo brothers need to pull a George Lucas and make an edit where he's not kissing her. They also wrote Endgame, so let this be a lesson in going back and reading what you previously written. The other issue is Spider-Man's intro scene. Aunt May just lets Tony Stark, this adult stranger, be alone with her teenage nephew, where Stark then proceeds to lock the door and tell Peter to lie to May about where he's going with him without her supervision and what he's doing. She is not a good guardian. An almost perfect film, but it feels a bit short because of those issues. Number 5, Winter Soldier. This movie is perfect. Even honest trailers couldn't make fun of it. It's also arguably the most accessible MCU movie, as it doesn't feel like a comic book movie at all. It's more of a Tom Clancy-esque political thriller. The action is well done, the story is intriguing, Cap and Black Widow have great chemistry, which makes me mad they didn't end up together. The villain is one of the best non-superpowered villains in the MCU with a despicable plan. This is one of my favorite non-Avengers MCU films. Number 4, Avengers. Well, maybe now it's not quite as ambitious as the other Avengers films, because we have come such a long way since this film came out. It's still really good. Even though story-wise it's a bit smaller scale now, and maybe the villains are kind of generic, the cast and writing are what carried the film. The cast is very entertaining with their quick back and forth with each other, the panorama shots in the film that show all of them are well directed by the cinematographer, and it's still a fun ride even all these years later. Number 3, Endgame. An almost perfect finale to over 20 films of build-up. There's really only one issue I have with the film. They have Cap go back to live with Peggy, like I already said, instead of having him choose Black Widow. Because even before she dies, there's nice little scenes of them just talking, and they still do have good chemistry. Thor also gets a bit of closure to some of the more traumatic events in his life, which is nice. This is almost everything I'd want from a film of this nature. It works really well, even if it's not quite perfect. Number 2, Infinity War. For a film with such a big cast and 20 films of build-up, there was a huge risk of it being overstuffed. But miraculously, it works. All the actors keep up with each other incredibly well, the film has one of the darkest openings in the MCU, and Thanos is one of the greatest villains in cinematic history, up there with the likes of Darth Vader. They make him complex, and though you don't agree with what he's doing, you understand why. It's got big spectacle, a compelling story, and one of the best twist endings in cinema history. And in first place is Spider-Man No Way Home. Some of you are probably thinking that I'm just blinded by nostalgia and that I only like it because of the novelty. And while that is partially true, nostalgia aside, the film works because of its characters and the way their arcs are resolved. Toby's Spidey gets to be the cool older mentor to the other 2 Spideys. Garfield's Spidey finally gets closure over Gwen's death. By the end of the film, Tom Holland's Spidey has grown as a character the more he has in the other films. The other 2 films he was thought of as the successor to Stark. By the end of the film, he is his own man. He gets a fresh reset. He gets a chance to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man he always wanted to be. He's learned how to control his anger and grief, and how to be responsible with his powers. For some, this may be nothing more than a novelty film, but for me, I think it's a film that brings one of the best closures to a character in the MCU, so it comes in at number 1. If you're going to share ranking of the MCU films, or at least ones you've seen, you can also include the Disney Plus shows, you can include Deadpool Wolverine in your rankings. This is just my ranking. Let me know what yours is in the comments, and I'll see you next time.